1931. Inside Bumpy Johnson's brutal war with Dutch Schultz the day New York shook, March 17, 1931. 2:47 a.m. Sugar Hill, Harlem. Bumpy Johnson stood in the doorway of a burning building on 145th Street, flames licking the walls behind him, smoke billowing into the cold night air. In front of him, 6 of Dutch Schultz's most dangerous enforcers had their weapons drawn. The lead man, a killer named Joey the Razor Carbone, pressed a .45 against Bumpy's forehead. Behind Bumpy, 3 families, women and children, huddled in the smoke-filled hallway, trapped between fire and bullets. "This is what happens when you mess with Dutch Schultz," Joey sneered, cocking the hammer. "Any last words, En?" The room went silent. Flames crackled. Children cried. And Bumpy Johnson, with a gun to his head and death surrounding him on all sides, did something that would become legend in the streets of New York. He smiled. "Tell Dutch I said thank you." Joey's face twisted in confusion. "Thank you for what?" Bumpy's eyes never wavered. "For sending all of you to one place." What happened next didn't just save those families. It ignited a war that would reshape Harlem forever. And if you're not subscribed yet, trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. To understand what happened in that burning building, you need to understand what was happening in Harlem in 1931, and why a man named Dutch Schultz was willing to burn entire neighborhoods to the ground. By 1931, Harlem was a kingdom built on numbers. The numbers racket, an underground lottery where poor folks bet pennies and nickels on 3-digit combinations, was generating $20 million a year. That's over $400 million in today's money. And the person who controlled that money controlled Harlem. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair. They called her Madame Queen, a woman from Martinique who'd built an empire through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an understanding that the numbers weren't just gambling, they were hope. Hope for people the legitimate economy had abandoned. Hope for families that banks wouldn't touch. Hope that tomorrow might be different than today. Madame Queen employed hundreds. She paid off cops, politicians, judges. She owned Harlem's underground economy with an iron fist wrapped in silk, and she had one man she trusted above all others to protect what she'd built. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. The streets called him Bumpy because of a distinctive lump on the back of his head. He'd come up hard, born in Charleston, South Carolina, shipped to Harlem at 14 after beating a white man nearly to death for calling his sister a slur. By 25, he was known as the most dangerous man in Harlem. Not because he was the strongest, though at 57 and 165 pounds he could break men twice his size. Not because he was the most violent, though his reputation for creative retribution was whispered about in every bar from 110th to 155th Street. No, Bumpy Johnson was dangerous because he was smart, because he listened more than he talked, because he understood that real power wasn't about making people fear you, it was about making them need you. But in 1931, a storm was coming to Harlem, and that storm had a name, Arthur Flegenheimer. The world knew him as Dutch Schultz, a Jewish gangster from the Bronx who'd built a bootlegging empire worth $40 million. He controlled beer distribution across New York. Politicians answered his phone calls. Police captains cashed his checks. But prohibition was ending and Dutch needed a new revenue stream. He looked north. He saw Harlem's numbers money. And he decided to take it. Dutch Schultz wasn't subtle. His philosophy was simple: burn what you can't buy, kill what you can't burn. He'd started in the Bronx that way, torching businesses that wouldn't pay protection, gunning down rivals in broad daylight. The newspapers called him the beer baron. The streets called him the Dutchman. What Dutch didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, was that Harlem wasn't the Bronx. Harlem wasn't territory you could conquer with guns and gasoline. Harlem was a community, a culture, a people who'd built something beautiful in a world that tried to deny them everything. Dutch sent word to Madame Queen in February 1931. The message was simple: 50% of the numbers operation, or war. Stephanie St. Clair's response became famous. She took out an advertisement in the New York Amsterdam News. 4 words: Harlem is not for sale. Dutch Schultz didn't take rejection well. Here's what the history books don't tell you. Dutch Schultz didn't just want Harlem's money. He wanted to humiliate the people who defied him. He wanted to make an example so brutal, so complete, that no one would ever question him again. On March 1, 1931, Dutch called a meeting at his headquarters in the Bronx. 12 of his most trusted men sat around a table covered with maps of Harlem. Every numbers bank, every collection point, every business that paid protection to Madame Queen. "We hit them everywhere at once," Dutch said, stabbing the map with his finger. "Burn the banks, kill the collectors, make the people understand that betting with St. Clair means betting with fire." His second-in-command, Abraham Bo Weinberg, leaned forward. "What about Johnson? Word is he's dangerous." Dutch laughed. "Johnson, he's one man. One man doesn't stop an army." Bo Weinberg would later regret not pushing harder, but in that moment he just nodded. Dutch's plan was systematic. Over 2 weeks in March, his men would attack 15 different locations across Harlem. Numbers banks would burn, collectors would disappear. Families who worked for Madame Queen would receive visits in the night, visits that ended with broken bones and burned homes. The message would be clear: submit to Dutch Schultz or lose everything. What Dutch didn't know, what his spies couldn't tell him, was that Bumpy Johnson had been preparing for this war for 6 months. And the preparations went deeper than anyone could imagine. Here's the thing about Bumpy Johnson. While Dutch was counting guns and soldiers, Bumpy was counting something else entirely: information. Bumpy had cultivated a network that stretched into every corner of New York's underworld. Shoeshine boys in the Bronx who heard Dutch's men talking. Cleaning women in police precincts who read reports left on desks. Bartenders in Italian social clubs who poured drinks for men who talked too freely. 2 weeks before Dutch's meeting, Bumpy knew the attack was coming. 3 days before, he knew the targets. 1 day before, he knew the names of every man Dutch was sending. "You know what makes a man dangerous?" Bumpy once told his lieutenant, Junie Byad. "It ain't his gun, it ain't his muscle, it's knowing what his enemy is going to do before his enemy does it." Bumpy's counter-strategy was elegant in its simplicity. He wouldn't try to stop all 15 attacks. That would spread his men too thin. Instead, he identified the 3 attacks Dutch had personally prioritized. The 3 locations where Dutch was sending his best men. The 3 places where Dutch expected decisive victories. Bumpy would let the other attacks happen. Small losses, acceptable sacrifices, but at those 3 critical points he would be waiting. And he would make Dutch Schultz pay in blood for every inch of Harlem dirt he thought he could take. March 15, 1931. 11:30 p.m. The first target was a numbers bank on 134th Street. Dutch sent 8 men led by Frankie Rio, a Chicago killer on loan from Al Capone. They kicked in the door expecting to find terrified clerks and unguarded cash boxes. Instead, they found an empty room and a note taped to the wall, "Looking for something?" Before Frankie could process what was happening, the lights went out. In the darkness, shapes moved. Sounds, wet, ugly sounds, echoed through the empty space. When the police arrived the next morning, they found 8 men tied to chairs, all alive, all missing their trigger fingers. Bumpy had made his first statement. March 16th. 1:15 a.m. The second target was a warehouse on 139th Street where Madame Queen stored her records. Dutch sent 12 men this time, led by Vincent Mad Dog Call, a psychopath even other gangsters feared. They brought gasoline. They brought guns. They brought the kind of rage that had made Dutch Schultz's name a curse word in the Bronx. Mad Dog kicked in the warehouse door and found Bumpy Johnson sitting alone at a table, playing solitaire by candlelight. "You're either the bravest man I've ever seen," Mad Dog said, "or the stupidest." Bumpy didn't look up from his cards. "You ever hear of a honeypot?" Mad Dog's eyes went wide as he realized, too late, that the warehouse windows were filled with silhouettes, men with rifles. Men who'd been waiting for Dutch's killers to walk into the perfect kill zone. "Tell Dutch something for me," Bumpy said, finally looking up. "Tell him every time he sends men into Harlem, fewer men go home." Of the 12 men who entered that warehouse, 9 left in ambulances. Mad Dog Call himself took a bullet to the shoulder, a wound that would give him his famous twitch for the rest of his short life. But Dutch Schultz wasn't a man who learned from setbacks. Anything, the losses made him angrier, more reckless, which is exactly what Bumpy was counting on. March 17, 1931. 2:00 a.m. The third target. Dutch decided to send a message so brutal it would break Harlem's spirit forever. He chose a tenement building on 145th Street, a building where 3 families who worked as numbers collectors lived. He sent 6 of his best men, led by Joey the Razor Carbone. Their orders: burn the building. With the families inside. What Dutch didn't know was that Bumpy had received word of this plan 18 hours earlier. He'd evacuated the men from those families, sent them to safe houses across the city. But he'd left the women and children. He'd left them because he needed witnesses. He needed the world to see what Dutch Schultz was willing to do and what Bumpy Johnson was willing to do to stop him. At 2:30 a.m., Joey Carbone and his men doused the first floor in gasoline and struck a match. Flames climbed the walls, smoke filled the stairwells, and 3 floors up, women and children woke to screaming. At 2:45 a.m., Bumpy Johnson walked through the front door of a burning building. He walked alone. The fire was spreading. The women and children were trapped on the 3rd floor. Joey Carbone and 6 killers stood in the hallway, weapons drawn, blocking the only staircase. Any other man would have come with an army. Any other man would have tried to negotiate. Bumpy walked straight toward them. Joey raised his .45. "Stop right there." Bumpy kept walking. "I said stop." Joey pressed the gun against Bumpy's forehead. Bumpy stopped, smiled, and said 4 words that would echo through Harlem history. "Tell Dutch I said thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For sending all of you to one place." In that moment, Joey Carbone heard a sound, a soft click from somewhere in the smoke, then another, then 6 more. His men heard it too. They spun around, trying to identify the source, but the smoke was too thick, the fire too loud. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, were the 8 men who'd come through the back entrance. Men who'd been waiting for this moment. Men who now had Joey Carbone and his killers surrounded. Bumpy hadn't walked into that building alone. He'd walked in as bait. "Here's how this works," Bumpy said, his voice calm as the flames grew around them. "You're going to drop your weapons. You're going to walk out of this building. And you're going to tell Dutch Schultz that if he ever sends men into Harlem again, if he ever threatens another family, another child, another person in my neighborhood, I won't be this merciful." Joey Carbone's hand shook. The gun wavered. "You expect me to believe you'll let us walk?" Joey spat. "After what we did?" Bumpy's smile faded. His eyes went cold. "I didn't say you'd walk out whole." What happened next, the people of Harlem talked about for 50 years. Joey Carbone and his men dropped their weapons. They were escorted out of the burning building by Bumpy's men. The women and children were carried to safety. The building was lost, but not a single life. And Joey Carbone, he was found the next morning on Dutch Schultz's doorstep in the Bronx, alive, but with a message carved into his chest, 2 words that would haunt Dutch Schultz for the rest of his life. "Harlem remembers." Word spread through New York like the fire that had consumed that tenement building. By sunrise, every gangster from Boston to Baltimore knew what happened. Dutch Schultz had sent his best men to burn Harlem families alive. Bumpy Johnson had walked into the flames and walked out victorious. The 5 families, the Italian bosses who controlled organized crime in New York, called an emergency meeting that same day. "Schultz has lost control," Lucky Luciano said. "He's drawing attention, heat, the kind of heat that's bad for everyone's business." Frank Costello nodded slowly. "Johnson played this perfectly. He didn't start the war, Schultz did. He didn't escalate, he responded. And now he looks like a hero protecting his people while Dutch looks like a monster burning children." "What do we do?" asked Vito Genovese. Luciano lit a cigarette. "We tell Dutch that Harlem is off limits, Johnson's territory. Anyone who violates that answers to all of us." It was the first time the 5 families had ever intervened in a territorial dispute to protect a black man's interests. But they weren't protecting Bumpy out of respect. They were protecting their own business from Dutch Schultz's recklessness. The result was the same either way. Dutch Schultz was ordered to stand down. He refused, of course. Spent the next 4 years trying to take Harlem through politics, through bribery, through occasional violence. None of it worked. Bumpy Johnson had proven something that night in the burning building. He'd proven that Harlem wasn't territory to be conquered. It was a community to be defended. In 1935, Dutch Schultz proposed assassinating Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor investigating organized crime. The 5 families decided that was too much heat. They had Dutch killed instead. Bumpy Johnson attended Dutch Schultz's funeral, not out of respect, out of satisfaction. Here's what people miss about that night in the burning building. Bumpy didn't win because he was tougher than Dutch Schultz. He didn't win because he had more men or more guns. He won because he understood something Dutch never could. Power isn't about what you're willing to destroy, it's about what you're willing to protect. Dutch saw Harlem as money to be taken. Bumpy saw Harlem as people to be defended. That's why the mothers who huddled in that burning building raised their children telling stories about Bumpy Johnson. That's why Dutch Schultz died alone and unmourned. That's why, 90 years later, we're still talking about a man who walked into flames and came out a legend. The most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It isn't fire. It's a man who knows his enemies' moves before they make them, and who fights not for money, not for territory, but for the people counting on him. Now look, if this story hit different, if you felt that, do me a favor and smash that like button. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? We're telling these Bumpy Johnson stories every week, and the next one, even crazier. Drop a comment. Could Bumpy have handled Dutch differently? Would you have let Joey Carbone live? And turn on those notifications, because next week we're breaking down the time Bumpy Johnson made Lucky Luciano himself apologize, in public, for disrespecting Harlem. Remember, in Harlem, respect wasn't given, it was earned. And Bumpy Johnson earned his in fire.